want you to take just a second and think through this little progression of where we've been. Because if you don't do this, you're going to miss what Numbers is about. So if we have, assuming we're Israelites here, okay? If we've just come through the Red Sea about a month ago, and we've been constituted into a nation from the book of Exodus, and God has moved in with us in Leviticus, then what should happen in the next book or chapter of this story? What should today be about? What should it be about? It's not, but what should it be about? We should be going right into the land, right? Exactly. Because you think about this with God's little, to-do list, if God has a to-do list, right? Get people out of Egypt, check. Make them into a nation, check. Settle in among them, check, right? I mean, things are just progressing. Things are moving at divinely ordained sovereign speed, right? And then we get down here, give them the land, and oops, big problem, right? Something happens here that doesn't happen. And so what takes its place? 40-year death march, check, right? And you should look at that and say, where did that come from, right? Well, didn't see that one coming. What is going on here? And that's what Numbers is about. Numbers is, why in the world does this show up in the checklist when we never saw that one coming and it shouldn't be there and we don't like it? What gives? And Numbers kind of addresses that issue, okay? It's a really big deal. Up until this point, we've seen this, again, as I said, this sovereign movement, and it's like, wow, this thing is really going to happen, right? And then all of a sudden, no, it's not going to happen, or at least it's delayed. So the book in a nutshell is like this. The next steps toward the promises are initiated by God, but they are delayed, and this is kind of the key, by Israel's unfaithfulness, right? So what we're going to see here is Israel's unfaithfulness is starting to enter into the picture, and the question is, what does that do to the big equation? So here's a little preview. We have seen God's promises working, and now Israel's rebellion enters the picture. And this is what Numbers does for us. I mean, we've seen Jacob do dumb things. We've seen even Abraham do dumb things, But God just kind of overrules those things and makes the whole thing work. And now we're going to see here, for the very first time, something human freedom gets out of control, and it does look like it really affects the program for a while. So we're going to kind of study that, and not just study the Israel's rebellion, but also study what does this tell us about God Himself and how He responds to us. So you can take this question or this issue, and you can discuss it on a very kind of abstract, theoretical plane. Right? How does human responsibility influence or affect God's sovereignty? And some of you may have done this in SPIFO or other classes or just in dorm room discussions. You may have discussed it under, how does election or God's choosing people for salvation versus their responsibility, how do those two fit together? Right? Or you can take this same fairly abstract theological discussion, and you can have the same kind of discussion, but on a much more personal, practical level, right? Like this one. How does my foolishness or my faithfulness, either one, negative or positive, influence or affect God's plan for my life? Now, maybe you've never thought about that, but maybe you have, right? Maybe you thought, okay, if I'm following God, but I take a little detour in my personal obedience to Him, is it possible that if I got off track for long enough that I couldn't get back on track? I mean, it wouldn't be that perfect person that God has for me, if I get off track, that person wouldn't marry someone else, would they? And then I would be left with plan B or plan C or, plan D, But I don't know if you ever think about those things or not, but I think it's worth thinking about. How does my faithfulness or my foolishness affect God's plan? If I sin, does God simply wipe it all out and put me right back on track? Is that the way it works, or is there a price to be paid? Those are really important personal and practical questions that all relate to this kind of big idea. Right? So let's get on with it, and let me talk to you about this little book. This little book by Don Carson. I don't know if you recognize those initials or that name, D.A. Carson, but he's one of the leading theologians of today. And a couple of years ago, I saw this little book. It's not a long book. It's like 100 pages. I picked it up to read it, partly because the title intrigued me. I mean, I don't know if it intrigues you or not. When I read the words, "the difficult doctrine of," I expect to see hell or election. I don't expect to see the love of God. Come on, what can be hard about that? He loves us unconditionally. It's great, right? I mean, that's what we love to sing about. And Carson says, no, actually, this is what makes it difficult, because you cannot simply say that the love of God is unconditional, because as you look biblically at this, there are like 5 different aspects that he chooses to talk about. And one of them almost sounds heretical. One of them is the conditional love of God. We say, well, wait. We've learned in the Old Testament it's always unconditional. Well, we've learned a lot about the unconditional love of God. But Carson said what makes it difficult is the whole spectrum is there is a conditional love of God as well that we need to talk about, that we often don't, right? Because we take a look at the things we want to look at and maybe not all the things we should look at. And this book is, in some senses, going to do that. So let me get onto it, and let's get right into the book here. First 10 chapters, okay? First 10 chapters are going to kind of set us up. They're going to provide a background, and I'll show you what I'm talking about. What happens here in the first 10 chapters is that Israel's camp is ordered by God, chapters 1 to 10. By that, I simply mean this. God tells the people where to live, right? And how to do things. It's kind of like, okay, now that we've become a nation, we got to get this thing organized. We got to get set up. And so, as we saw before, slightly less cartoonish, God's tent in the middle, everybody else's tent on the outside. But you might see some names here you're not real familiar with, like Kohathites and Merarites. Dan is familiar. We know that's a tribe. But what's going on here? Well, here again is a little bit, we'll zoom out a little bit, and you can see the basic structure. And here is what it looks like. And so you immediately recognize this outer ring, Simeon, Reuben, Gad, Manasseh, Ephraim, and Benjamin. Like those are the 12 tribes. But who are these guys in here? And the answer is, these are all Levites from the tribe of Levi. These are various clans, Kohathites, Gershonites, Merarites. And then these over here are the priests, which are indeed a subset of the Levites. You don't have to know that for the test. I'm just letting you know here. It's kind of interesting because the tabernacle, remember, the door to the tabernacle is on the east. Remember we talked about that just a little bit, like the Garden of Eden, from the east. And so Moses and Aaron and the priests are sitting right here at the door. And then look who's right behind them. Judah is. Interesting. Right. So anyway, he says, okay, here's how I want you to camp. Now that's not hard, right? If God says I want you to camp here, it's pretty easy to arrange your tents, right? And that's exactly what they do. And so the theme kind of these first 10 chapters is this. What God asks is not difficult. But what is repeated over and over in the text is simply that the people do it. Now, this makes for a very happy relationship, okay? Now, you might think, well, that doesn't sound all that profound. Well, it's not, but just watch the way this sets us up for what is going to happen. And let me just give you a quick little overview to show you how I arrive at this stuff, right? And it's not rocket science. It's just simple, basic Bible study. There's this repeated phrase. So let me just work you through here really quickly. For example, Numbers chapter 1. As the Lord commanded Moses, so he counted them in the desert of Sinai. Now, if that's all there were, your attention wouldn't be attracted to it. But when you see it again in Numbers chapter 1, just as the Lord commanded Moses, and you see it in Numbers 2, Israelites did everything the Lord commanded Moses, and you see it in chapter 3, as he was commanded by the word of the Lord, and you see it in chapter 4, you begin to realize Moses is trying to pepper this phrase to help you understand that people are doing exactly what they're supposed to do. And here in chapter 5, just as the Lord had instructed Moses. And then, you don't see the phrase here, but this is just such a sweet little section. I got to camp out here just for a second. Numbers 7. When Moses entered the tent of meeting to speak with the Lord, he heard the voice speaking to him from between the 2 cherubim above the atonement cover on the ark of the testimony, and he spoke with him, right? So between the 2 cherubim. So here are the cherubim, and here's God's presence here, and Moses can go in there. Now, when we talked about Leviticus, we said the only person who can go in here is the high priest one time a year on the Day of Atonement. That is true, but there's one exception in the entire Old Testament. The only guy who actually can go in there whenever he wants to is Moses. Only guy who can do that. Which makes it all the more special when we get to Deuteronomy 18, and Moses says, one of these days, God is going to raise up another prophet just like me, who speaks with him face to face. Gee, I wonder who that is. Right? So Moses kind of gets to break the protocol here a little bit because he's a picture of somebody else who's going to have immediate access to the face of the Father. But But be that as it may, let's just go back to this and imagine. Let's just imagine for right now that just to the south of our building, we set up a tent. And God comes down and he actually lives in the tent. Right? And nobody can go in the tent, but the president, Dr. White, can go in the tent. And he has this habit, let's just pretend he has this habit, every Monday morning at 9 o'clock, Dr. White goes into the tent and he speaks with God face to face for an hour, just before chapel. So he goes from that tent to over there. Would you want to go to chapel on Mondays, if that were the case? I mean, talk about name dropping. Yeah, I was just talking to, right, and here's what God had to say. Well, of course, if you had any spiritual sense at all, you would absolutely go nuts to hear your leader talk to you about what God had just said to him, right? And I'm just saying, this is a sweet situation. This is an incredibly sweet situation. You're supposed to see that all the way through these first 10 chapters, okay? Go on to chapter 8. They made a lampstand, exactly like the pattern the Lord had shown Moses. Not a big deal, but he does it just exactly right. And all the way down through here, you get the idea, okay? Now, what I'm trying to say is this, that in Numbers chapter 9, that phrase stops completely. Stops completely. And we're going to transition to another topic. And the topic we're going to transition to is this. Oh man, I did it again. You can't see that very well, can you? Bad font selection. Oh, there we go. Does that help? This one or this one? This one or this one? You know, we did this before, I think, one time. I can't remember when. I think it was Genesis 38, 39. Remember that? Well, all I want to say is Israel's failure and sin, that yellow font was the same thing on the previous screen. But you don't see Israel's failure and sin unless you have a little bit of backdrop to it. Right? So what I'm trying to say is this. What we're going to see here is Israel's failure and sin caused a delay in God's program for them, but we wouldn't see that nearly as clearly if we didn't have the background of 1 to 10. In 1 to 10, you've got obedience, 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 and everybody's happy. Things are going great. And then here in 10 to 21, everything falls apart. The wheels fall off. And I think what that does is it says, okay, were these people destined to disobey? And the answer is no. How do you know? Because the first 10 chapters show them doing it right. They could have continued doing what they were doing in 1 to 9 or 1 to 10 if they'd wanted to, but they chose not to, which makes their sin and their failure all the more culpable. Okay? Well, they're all the more responsible for it. So, let's take a look at this little, where it begins in chapter 10. And I want to show you a couple of steps to their downfall. I want to start out here with this first one. Moses' lack of faith, question mark, in God's direction. Now, I put a question mark because I'm not totally sure I'm right about this. Okay? I'm just kind of going out on a limb here. I'm not sure this is the right thing to do. So I'll show you what I'm talking about, and you help me decide. This is a place where they're going to start traveling through the wilderness. And Moses goes to his brother-in-law, Hobab. It's a great name. I'll offer you extra credit if you name a firstborn child Hobab. Just saying, okay? So verse 29. Now Moses said to Hobab, this is chapter 10, I believe. Moses said to Hobab, son of Reuel the Midianite, Moses' father-in-law, so that makes him his brother-in-law. We're setting out for the place about which the Lord said, I will give it to you. Come with us, and we will treat you well, for the Lord has promised good things to Israel. He answered, nope, I will not go. I'm going back to my own land and my own people. But Moses said, please do not leave us. You know where we should camp in the desert, and you can be our eyes. Right? Now, I'm not so sure this is a really awful, wicked, terrible thing. But I wonder if when you did your reading, did anybody read through here and read this section and just kind of have a little question mark arise in your head about him asking Hobab to do this? Anybody at all? Did you look at this and wonder why he's doing that? Yeah. You thought it was what? Weird? Yeah, like flattery. Yeah, you can be our eyes. Now he does know where to go. I'm sure that's true, but it does look a little bit like flattery, something like that. Anything else in the text at all that you might have seen? Now again, I know you got to get through it in 45 minutes. You may not see it, but there's something over. All you have to do. I'll show you what I'm going to do. I'm just going to scoot over here to the previous page, and talk about this cloud above the tabernacle. You know what I'm talking about? Why ask Hobab? Because God in the previous chapter has said, whenever I move the cloud, you go, right? Now let's just go back and look at this for a second. And it starts right here in chapter 9, verse 15. On the day of the tabernacle, the tent of the testimony was set up. The cloud covered it. From evening till morning, the cloud covered the tabernacle and looked like fire. That's how it continued to be. The cloud covered it, and at night it looked like fire. I think I've got the picture, don't you? Whenever the cloud lifted from above the tent, the Israelites set out. Wherever the cloud settled, the Israelites encamped. That's a fairly simple principle. I think I've got it. But Moses says, no, let me go on because I think you're stupid. All right? Verse 18. At the Lord's command, the Israelites set out. At his command, they encamped. As long as the cloud stayed over the tabernacle, they remained encamped. When the cloud remained over the tabernacle a long time, the Israelites obeyed the Lord's order and did not set out. By this time, I'm thinking, Moses, I'm not this stupid, okay? I got the principle. But he just keeps going on and on and on and saying the same thing all the way down through here, right? Now, why? Well, because I don't think Moses is a bad writer. I just think Moses is trying to really, really be clear. If God is the one who is doing this for us and directing us, then I just have to go across the page and wonder, well, now, why do we need Hobab so much, right? So I'm not saying this is a terrible thing, but I think it might be just like one little small step in the wrong direction. Why do we need Hobab? I see Moses here a little bit lacking on his faith. I'm guessing. Part of the reason I do that is because if you go on to the next part, the people's complaint on the outskirts of the camp, that is clearly a bad idea. The text tells us in chapter 11, the people complained about their hardships and hearing the Lord, and when he heard this, his anger was aroused. Now that might seem like God is kind of touchy, short fuse, but I don't think so. I think, again, if we knew the background, people are complaining about the manna, the what is it, right? And God isn't real happy with them when they complain, and so he sends fire down to punish the kind of sin which is there. Again, let's trust that behind the text that these people really do deserve what they're getting. Okay, and then it goes to here. The people complain about the food in chapter 11, verses 4 to 10, and notice at the beginning it says these were people on the outskirts of the camp. Right, this is the beginning. Now, it says, Moses heard the people of every family wailing, each at the entrance to his own tent. They're complaining. And then in chapter 11, Miriam and Aaron complained against Moses because of his wife. And then in 13 and 14, we find ourselves at this place. They send out the 12 spies. 2 come back and say yes. 10 come back and say no. And the people vote no. Right? Now, we call this place, this happens at a place called Kadesh Barnea. I'll show you that in a second. But what I want you to notice about this, and I know I've skimmed over it real fast here, but now I want to pull it back together. I want you to notice the development of the attitude and the progression of the sin. What I'm talking about is this. We started out there with that seemingly such a subtle situation with Moses under 1C that we had to even kind of debate about whether or not this was a bad idea or not. But then it gets progressively worse till we get down here to chapters 13 and 14 when they clearly make a really big, bad decision from which they can't recover. Right? And they try, and they say, oh, time out, bad choice, here, we'll go up into the land. And God says, no, that's stupid. No, it's okay, we'll go. And God says, you can go, but you're going to get beat back. And they do, and they have this horrible defeat. Right? They cannot change this choice. This is a 40-year death sentence right here. Now, what's the deal? Well, what I want you to see is, again, this progression, and it helps if we put it out here on kind of a little map, right? So our big purple ball here is kind of like the camp of Israel. Notice that the sin starts on the outskirts, then it moves to every tent, and then it moves to the heart of the leadership. You see what's happening here? It just converges. And then finally, we get to this big, deliberate, callous decision on the part of the whole nation that they can't recover from. Now, I hope you see a little bit of the lesson here, right? I mean, I doubt that any of us here are probably going to make one of those kind of decisions that alters the course of our lives from which you can't recover just like that. I think probably what's going to happen is there are going to be just kind of little sins in the outskirts of our lives, right, that start to harden your heart and harden your heart and harden your heart to the point where all of a sudden you do something really stupid that does have some lasting consequences, and you wake up and you say, how did that happen? It happened because your heart got hard because of allowing little things into your life, right? And so anyway, it does here, and all of a sudden they have this decision that they can't recover from. So that's the development of the attitude, is the way the progression moves. But then notice also the deliberateness of the sin and the wording of the judgment. The deliberateness is this. In chapter 13, here's the way the story goes. And I just want you to see exactly the phrasing here. The spies come back. They gave Moses this account. And they said, look, we went into the land, and it does flow with milk and honey, but the people who live there are powerful. And the cities are fortified and very large. We even saw the descendants of Anak there. The Amalekites live in the Negev, the Hittites, the Jebusites, all these other people, right? And all the way down through here, you get the impression that Caleb and Joshua come along and say, look, these people are big, but we can take them, right? And the 10 spies are saying, but there's Anakites, right? The sons of Anak, the Anakites, right? And the people are saying, ooh, we're scared. The Anakites are there? Yes, the Anakites are there, right? And Joshua and Caleb are saying, Anakites, Shmanakites, we can take them with God's help. And the 10 are saying, no, those big Anakites. Right? And so everybody votes no, and Joshua and Caleb are hanging their heads thinking, oh my goodness, what a bad choice this is. But then there's an exception for Caleb. And the exception is this: but because my servant Caleb, and Joshua too, has a different spirit and follows me wholeheartedly, I will bring him into the land he went to, and his descendants will inherit it. But the rest of you guys are going to die off over the next 40 years. Okay? So they try to stone Caleb and Joshua, and they really do deserve what they get here, but there is at least hope for Caleb. Now, I put those up there because 2 weeks from now, I'm going to ask you about Anakites, and 2 weeks from now, I'm going to ask you about this passage, this promise for Caleb, too. So, let me show you where we are. It's not a very good map because it's not very bright, kind of like me. All right, but here, we got Egypt over here. You can see the Nile Delta. You got the Sinai Peninsula out here, the Red Sea on both sides of it. Israel is up in here, and Moab is to the right. I say that because we're going to get to the story of Moab and Balaam and the donkey in a little bit. But the spot where this all happens is called Kadesh Barnea. And sometimes I'll just refer to it as Kadesh Barnea. This is where the spies go out. You can see they're just on the kind of the southern tip of Israel there. That's why they getting ready to go into the land. That's why it happens there. Okay. But here again is another picture just to orient you to it. You can see the Nile Delta up in here. And again, the Sinai here. You can see the Dead Sea right in here just to orient yourself so you know where you are. So Kadesh Barnea is probably around in here somewhere. Here's again another shot, and you can see some of the mountainous regions in the southern Sinai, probably where Mount Sinai is. But all of this land out here is really, really barren stuff, right? I mean, just look, here's a typical picture. You can see the great forest. It's a beautiful forest. See, there's green there. I think there's another little bit of green right there, right? I mean, it's just absolutely lush, right? And so what I want you to think of is just imagine 40 years there. I mean, one of the most, I hope you get to go to Israel someday. It is incredibly worth it. One of the most existential, one of the most spiritually impactful moments was driving through this land in, you're always in an air-conditioned bus down here, but driving through, and it looks out, and it's beautiful in its starkness, but you don't realize it's 110 degrees outside. And so the bus stops, and we all get out, and the leader of our group says, okay, everybody spread out just by yourself for 15 minutes. And you walk out, and it's big winds are blowing. It's 110 degrees, and it feels like you're in front of a big hairdryer, like 6-foot hairdryer, right? And it's really hot, but it's like 0% humidity, so the sweat immediately dries up. It doesn't feel like, Midwestern humid hot. It's really hot, but you don't feel sweaty. It's just stark. And I remember going out and waiting for 15 minutes and just sitting there thinking. And in some ways, those 15 minutes felt like forever. And you're thinking to yourself, oh God, I cannot imagine living here for a month, for 12 months, for 40 years. And then I begin to think, okay, even in my own heart, Lord, I think I'm kind of a coward. I think if someone had said Anakites, I might have said, that scares me. But looking at this, man, I'd much rather take the fear of battle or whatever over the boredom of this. Then begin to say, God, don't let me make choices that put me in places like this. So after you had lived there for 40 years and all of your parents had died off, okay, you would probably wonder, does God remember about us? Now, it's very easy for us, hindsight is 20/20. But if you were living in this generation, you lived out there for 40 years, you'd begin to wonder, I wonder if God wandered off, if he still cares about us, if he's still going to bring us in the land, or if we have made such a stupid choice that God's going to give up on us. And I think God says, that is such a good question. That is such a good question. I'm not going to give it an answer, yes or no. Let me tell you a story. Right? So he tells them a story, and the story has to do about Balaam and Balak, and it is an answer to the question, does God remember? Fascinating story for a number of reasons, not least of which is the really wonderful talking donkey. Okay, so let's look at the answer to that question, does God remember? And it's right here. God blesses Israel through Balaam and protects her from unknown danger. So here's the deal. Balak, K stands for king. Not really, but just in my own little mnemonic world, okay? This is just me trying to keep these names straight. And it's dumb, I know. But Balak, K, in my mind stands for king. Balaam, M, stands for malicious prophet, okay? Because I'll often get the names mixed up. So Balak is the king of Moab, and Balaam is the malicious prophet sent to curse Israel. And Israel is getting ready now, under Joshua's leadership, to go up through Moab and come in from the east side of Israel through the Jordan River. But Balak doesn't want that, obviously, because he knows that Israel's so big that they will just take all of his crops and all of his good stuff and they will just pillage his land in the process. And so Balak comes to Balaam and says, I know that those you bless are blessed and those you curse are cursed. Now, what he's doing here is calling in for nuclear power. Absolutely, seriously. I mean, it's not a silly analogy. It really is what it is. He knows that by conventional forces, his army is way too small to take Israel. So he says, I got to go nuclear. I can't believe I said nuclear. Nuclear. Listening to too many past presidents. Right? I want to go nuclear here. And I'm going to call in some supernatural power. And that's exactly what he's doing. So he's calling in Balaam, who has access to supernatural power. Now, it does not imply that it's good supernatural power. In fact, it is quite negative supernatural power. But he calls it in for them to curse Israel, okay? Now, I hope that the phraseology there, those you bless are blessed and those you curse are cursed, I hope it rings a bell for you. It should. Because up to this point, we've been talking about the promises like this, land, nation, and leader, right? But it doesn't take very much to say, I'll bless those who bless you, and whoever curses you, I will curse, as a really good way to summarize the promises. So remember, what is the question? The question is, God, do you remember? Are you going to take us into the land? And it's really interesting, right here at the beginning, the chief bad guy kind of claims this. Right? Balak says to him, you're known for cursing people well. You're a good curser. Right? And people get cursed. So I want you to come and curse Israel. Well, what you got set up here immediately is this big contrast. Now, normally I would apologize for the cheesy clip art, but I don't here because I know this probably looks like Merlin or something from a Disney cartoon, but actually it's not a bad way to describe Balaam. Why? Because he is a sorcerer. Okay, that's exactly why he's called in here. Do not think of him as a good prophet. He is a sorcerer who has contact with the supernatural. And so immediately you've got this contrast between God, who has said, I'm going to bless those who bless you and curse those who curse you, and Balaam, the prophet over here, saying the same thing. Now, for you and for me, this is not a very difficult question to answer. Who's going to win? The prophet or God? Tough choice. No, not a tough choice at all. And so you say, well, was it a tough choice for Israel? And the answer is no. Israel knew that God could beat the prophet, right? But their question was, does God want to beat the prophet? Right? Does he care? So, yeah, good question. So let's see what goes on here. Now, some of you may have been sympathetic towards Balaam, because in some senses, if you don't read this carefully, you can be, sympathetic to him, because he does talk to God, right? So he's got to be a good guy, and the answer is, wait a minute, lots of people talk to God who are not good guys, right? And let me just cut to the chase and say this. In 2 Peter, we find out that Balaam, we find out in Numbers and Deuteronomy too, but 2 Peter confirms for us that Balaam is this polytheistic sorcerer, false prophet kind of guy. He talks to lots of different gods. Right? The fact that he talks to Yahweh doesn't mean he is obedient to Yahweh in any way. He just wants to get things from Yahweh. All right? So I'll just leave it at that. And then I want to talk about the deal with the talking donkey, because it's kind of I hope you understood what a wonderful story this is. Right? This is a good talking donkey. And donkey actually helps us here a little bit, right?
You know, in some cultures, donkeys are revered as the wisest of all creatures, especially as talking ones.
Right? In some cultures, donkeys are revered as the wisest of all creatures. Well, he'd like to think so. But the truth is, and part of the reason why the story works, is because in every culture, donkeys are revered as the most stubborn of all creatures and the dumbest of animals, right? And so that's why it's so funny that the donkey is rebuking the prophet, because that's the way the whole thing works out. He beats the donkey and beats the donkey a couple times, and the donkey says to him, "Look, what are you doing?" Right? And again, the funny part is that, that Balaam answers. He says, "Well, you crushed my foot against the wall." And the donkey says, "Now, let's sit back and talk about this, okay? Okay. How long have I been your donkey?" "Well, a long time." "Well, have I been in the habit of doing this to you before?" "Well, no, you really haven't." "Then don't you think something could be going wrong here?" "Oh, maybe it is. Maybe something's going on." And it's funny that the donkey, which normally can't talk, speaks somehow words that are rebuking the prophet. And now, why is that? Well, number one, it's funny and it's great and it shows the power of God. But more importantly, what God is trying to do is to give us a preview, because if you read the story carefully, you realize that the prophet is going to speak words that he actually doesn't want to speak, words which God makes him speak. Okay? So what God is doing with the donkey is kind of a little preview of what he's going to do with the prophet if you watch the words which he speaks, right? So let's do this. Let's take a look at this. So the contest is really set up here. Balaam, you're such a hot speaker. Is that true? Well, watch this, right? This is a contest of who is the more powerful speaker, then, bring it. Let's go. Let's see whose blessings really bless and whose cursings really curse. So there are 4 curses then. And we're going to take a look at them, obviously, in order. And you will notice that I put quotation marks around curse. Because even though Balaam gets up and he intends to curse, it really doesn't come out as a curse. So watch these words, okay? Numbers 23, the very first curse. And remember, reading the story, Balak has paid him lots of money to do this. So Balaam gets up, and he gets above them, and he says this: "From the rocky peaks I see them, from the heights I view them. I see a people who live apart and do not consider themselves one of the nations." So the situation is like this. Balaam's up here, Israel's down here. Israel doesn't even know that he's up there, but in the similar way that Isaac is going to pass the blessing on to Jacob or Esau, that's what he's doing. He's speaking the curse over them. So Israel doesn't even know what's going on, but he is speaking this alleged curse over them. Right? That's why he says, "From the rocky peaks I see them." But then he says, "I see a people who live apart and do not consider themselves just another one of the nations." Sound familiar to you? It should, because it relates to something really significant. Remember what it is? Exodus 19, right? "If you obey me and keep my covenant, you'll be a special possession out of all the nations, for all the earth is mine. You'll be a kingdom of priests and a holy nation." What is Balaam doing? Balaam is acknowledging, hey, these people are a separate nation. That's a reference to the Abrahamic promises, right? Genesis 12:2. And then he goes on to say, "Who can count the dust of Jacob or number the 4th part of Israel?" Again, where does that come from? Well, it comes directly from here. "I'm the Lord, the God of your grandfather Abraham, the God of your father Isaac." This is what God is saying to Jacob. Your descendants will be like the dust of the earth, and you'll spread out to the west, east, north, and south, right? God uses this same kind of analogy. To Abraham, he said, like the stars of the sky. To Isaac, he said, like the sand of the sea. And to Jacob, he says, like the dust of the earth. So when Balaam says, who can count the dust of Jacob or number the fourth part of Israel, again, he's referring back to the promises of Abraham given to Jacob here, right? And then he says, let me die the death of the righteous and may my end be like theirs, which is a Middle Eastern backhanded way of saying, man, I hope my life is as good as theirs, right? Now, I don't know if you recognize this or not, but this is not a curse. This is an affirmation of who they are. This is a blessing. And that's why, after he says it, Balak, the king, comes up to him and says, what in the world were you thinking? And Balaam says, I didn't mean to do that. And Balak says, you blessed them, you didn't curse them. And Balaam says, I know, I didn't mean to. I got up, I had this really good curse, and then this stuff came out of my mouth that really surprised me. And the donkey's sitting over thinking, now you know how I feel, right? And that's exactly the point. And so he says, look, I paid you big money to curse, and you blessed. And Balaam says, let me give another try. I'll get it right this time, okay? So he does. Curse number 2. Again, notice the quotation marks. So he gets up, and this time he says, God's not a man that he should lie, nor a son of man that he should change his mind. Does he speak and not act? Does he promise and not fulfill? And again, you say, let's see, that kind of reminds me of this, right? Same thing happens. Balak says, you have blessed them, not cursed them. I paid you big money. And so he says, okay, I know I didn't mean to. It won't happen again, so let me get up and try it again. Curse number 3. Like a lion, they crouch and lie down. Like a lioness, who dares to rouse them? May those who bless you be blessed, and those who curse you be cursed. Right? Now, these are the very words of Genesis chapter 12. Now look at that and tell me what just happened to Balak. What just happened to him? He just got cursed, right? Through the guy he pays money, he says, may those who curse you, Israel, be cursed. So that means that the curse actually falls on Balak, the king, right? And so Balak is just livid at this point. He says, look, I paid you big money 3 times. You got up there and you blessed them. Could you just please give me a real curse, right? He says, I know, I've been trying. It just hasn't, I don't know what's going on with my mouth, my tongue. It just says things I don't want it to say. And so I'll give you a curse, right? And so number 4, no quotation marks. It's a real curse. Right? And watch the way this curse works. He says, I see him, but not now. I behold him, but not near. A star will come out of Jacob. A scepter will rise out of Israel. Oh my goodness. Wait a minute. What is going on here? We know what these words are referring to, don't we? He will crush the foreheads of Moab and the skulls of all the sons of Sheth. Wait a minute. All these other things that he said went back to Genesis 12, but this one goes back even beyond that, doesn't it? What does this sound like? A person who's going to come back and smash your forehead. That's Genesis 3. And so in this powerful, beautiful story, if you're listening and you know the story, you say, is God going to keep those promises of Genesis 12? And the answer is, oh yeah, oh yeah, oh yeah. And you know what? By the way, all these things are founded on Genesis 3, and if he's not going to give up on Genesis 3, he's not going to give up on Genesis 12. And by the way, Moab, you're going to get your head crushed because you're on the same team as the snake, and when this one comes, the snake is going down, and you're going down too because you're part of his team. Now, given that, do you think you can answer the question, does God remember? Right? Like, wow, I guess he does, right? This God is going to come through for us. Now, let's try to wrap this whole thing up and say, what does this book do for us? Well, we've seen a little bit of the unconditional and the conditional love of God, right? How do you fit those two together? Do they contradict each other? And I want to say it like this. This is not a contradiction or a mysterious antinomy if you've heard the word, right? Rather, this is a normal part of the personality of a person. Right? And what I'm trying to say is, we're not dealing with the biggest cosmic computer in the sky. God is not a robot. God does not have this job to forgive all the time and not be affected by us. God is a person. Right? And he responds like a person does. And what Jesus' little half-brother Jude says is, keep yourself in God's love as you wait for the mercy of our Lord Jesus Christ to bring you eternal life. What he's saying is, keep yourself in a place where God can love you. You mean you can put yourself in a place where God can't love you? Yes, you can. And I'm not sure I totally understood this until I had adult children. Because when I was growing up, and even when I was a parent of little kids, whenever I would sin personally, I would feel guilty, and if I'd sin more and more, I would feel even more guilty. And the thought of confession was just embarrassing, because you say, okay, if I go and I confess the sin to God again, He's going to say, this is, we've been counting, this is number 328, and I think you're about up, Chris. So don't even bother me with this anymore. I don't want to. I'm really upset. I'm disappointed, and I don't want to hear this from you anymore. That was my fear, that was what God was going to feel like. And when I got adult children, I was amazed that I didn't feel like that, because they would follow God, and sometimes they wouldn't. Sometimes they would go off. They would veer off the path, and they would put themselves in places where they weren't living for God. And I was amazed at my own reaction. I was not angry at them. I know they thought I was, just like I thought my Heavenly Father. They thought I was angry, but I wasn't. I just grieved for them. And the trouble was this: I always want to do good things. I always want to bless them. I always want to give them things. And I said, man, I don't like the way you're living, because I cannot righteously bless you here. But I really want to. The desire of my heart as your father is to bless you and to do good things for you. And you're putting yourself in a place where I can't do that. And if they'd come back to me, when they would come back, right, and get their lives right, it wasn't like, I'm so disappointed in you. It's like, no, please come back. I'm so glad you come back. I wasn't mad at you. I just want you to start living so I can righteously bless you. This is what Jude is saying. Keep yourself in a place where God can love you, because He cannot righteously express His love towards you when you're living that way. This is the whole point of the prodigal son and the father, right? Does the father love the son? Absolutely. But when the son chooses to go off into the far country, does the father go get him and force him to come home? No. The father waits at the end of the driveway all the time. Says, man, I really want you to come back. I'm not going to force you, and I'm not going to kill the fatted calf for you while you're down there in the pig farm. You come back, and I can righteously do that. Put yourself in this place where I can show my overwhelming love for you. So you can put it like this, right? God's unconditional love will never change. It's like the safety net at the bottom, right? But I don't know how you say this. Is there more love to be had? However you describe it, that's the way it turns out to be. And you got two places you can be, right? Like the prodigal son, you can be home, or you can be down here in the far country. And again, God still loves you down here, but He can't express His love and put the ring on your finger and the robe on your back and kill the fatted calf until you come home here. So what is it like to live with God? What does this tell us about who God is? It tells us that, again, that He is this relational person who responds and relates to us and reacts to us like a person, not like some big elective slot machine in the sky. Right? There's this give and take relationship all of the time that's going back and forth. And you want your relationship to be better? It kind of depends upon, in some ways, how you respond to Him. So let me ask it this way. How should the book of Numbers have ended? And we talked about that at the very beginning, right? The book of Numbers should have ended with the people up in the land. That's not how it ended, because they made choices. But the bigger question here is, how will my story end? What kind of choices will I make? How will I relate to God? Will I put myself in a place where God can righteously express His love to me? Or will I test it and presume upon it? Story of Numbers, our story.